So let's start then with a short history and a short input on civil disobedience before Sarah will talk more about the role of civil disobedience for different movements across the world. We thought that first of all it is important to understand what we mean when we talk about civil disobedience. So I'm just going to give you some background on that. So civil disobedience or acts of civil disobedience usually occur in the relationship between citizens and their state. An act of civil disobedience, for instance, is when citizens willfully break certain laws, for example, by forming a peaceful blockade, blocking certain infrastructure or facilities, for instance. And they do that because their motivation is based on moral grounds. They feel like certain laws, policies, or whatever the government is doing is morally unjustifiable, and therefore their actions against the government, against certain laws, even though they are illegal, are morally justified. So in that sense, civil disobedience may be regarded, generally speaking, as something that is more defensible on moral grounds as compared to other acts of, something where offenses are handed out in forms of protests or militant actions. So there we see that civil disobedience is actually a bit different from other criminal offenses and other acts where criminal charges are being brought up against protesters. Also, civil disobedience has some key features. The first one is conscientiousness, which describes how individuals or groups of people that are acting civilly disobedient engage in such actions, pointing to the seriousness and the sincerity and the moral conviction that they have with which they do such acts. So they then understand them breaking the law as a necessity based not only on what one person or a group thinks, but something that concerns society at large, and by breaking such laws, something that will inevitably result in positive outcome for society. The second important feature, aside from conscientiousness, is communication. So with a lot of acts of civil disobedience, we see that the goal is often not only to condemn a certain law or a policy, but also to bring about change, to change laws, to change policies, and to change the course of action of governments specifically. And the third feature that is quite essential to civil disobedience is publicity, which very much connects to communication. So we see with a lot of actions that happened recently also that civil disobedience is seldom something that is done so secretly or in hidden sight. It is often done so publicly and openly, and even with some transparency, where groups, prior to whatever they're doing, communicate what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. So thereby also informing legal authorities, even though in an indirect way, but in some sense still. So then we have some other features that are a bit debated. I mean, there's the aspect of nonviolence. That would be a principle for some, saying that nonviolence or civil disobedience is only civil disobedience when it is nonviolent, because by whatever you're doing, you're not endangering the civil liberties of others. Being civil disobedience without interfering with the lives of others to the effect that it has a negative outcome. However, it is also worth mentioning that a lot of protesters that are acting civilly disobedient or civil disobedient experience violence nevertheless, even though they are themselves passive. So we also see that a lot of groups or individuals that are doing such acts are preparing to experience violence even though they commit to non-violence themselves. So experience violence being perpetuated on protesters by state authorities is something that happens regularly and that people also prepare for. Another contested issue, aside from the debate between violent or non-violent, is the question of whether activists and protesters must submit to arrest and cooperate actually with state authorities in their actions. And in practice, this can take many different shades. For instance, people may only follow orders or calls to leave a certain location or disperse by the police after multiple attempts by state authorities. So they're not listening right away, they're not acting on the will of the authorities right away. To people, passively resisting. We have, there's very popular images of people being carried away, people, putting in a bit of extra weight when state authorities or law enforcement is actually trying to disperse a protest or blockade. And there are even some that are actively trying to escape arrest violently or non-violently. I mean, that very much depends on the context in every situation. However, something that is also debated in this context is the fact that, and that's something that I'm going to talk about next when we talk about the history, is that some people actually feel it is their responsibility also to get arrested, to actually face arrest and to face the charges, because they feel like what they're doing is morally justified. So they also have to go through the process of proving that it is, and being charged and maybe even undergoing prosecution. And this is something where, again, opinions differ. Some people think, taking a bit of an anarchist position on the legitimacy of the state and disregarding that completely. Two people say, no, I'm doing this and I'm getting arrested for it, and I believe that is correct because I'm also obeying by the laws that apply to every other person. But I want to make the point that I did this for a reason, and I want this to change, and this also brings about some publicity in the end. While there maybe is no single definition of civil disobedience, understanding, as I've said, these features and types helps us to differentiate civil disobedience also from, for example, what we also see a lot, or have seen at least, large protests, which are often legal, or even direct actions. So civil disobedience is a very distinct form of political action that is sometimes mixed up, but not to be confused with, for instance, protests. So there are many good examples, as we will see now, in recent history that shows how civil disobedience has, in fact, acted as a very important way of bringing about change in society. And at this point, we only want to briefly mention a few of them to illustrate the idea that civil disobedience has in fact shown to be a very powerful and important political strategy employed by different movements in different contexts. And this is also why we feel in this workshop we want to talk more about the role of civil disobedience for the degrowth movement. One of the earliest examples of civil disobedience in history was the women's suffrage movement that started in the United States in the 1870s, advocating for the right of women to vote. Here, acts of civil disobedience, for instance, included Susan B. Anthony registering and voting, casting a ballot, which at the time was unlawful for women. But she refused to pay the fine that was given to her, stating that she felt that what was the law at the time was morally unjustified. Other acts of civil disobedience by women that took part in the movement included blockades and protests, which again resulted in jail sentences even, where some women had then to be forced to be fed, which caused a lot of public outcry and helped those women who also wanted to be treated as political prisoners and not as criminals to bring attention to their case, which inevitably resulted in the law that was finally giving women the right to vote in 1920. Another popular example is the American Civil Rights Movement and the case of Rosa Parks, who famously, as a black woman, refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white man under the then existing segregation laws. So Rosa Parks and her passive resistance helped to spark a nationwide movement calling for the abolition of the segregation laws that discriminated against people based on the color of their skin. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was finally the result of a year-long struggle that then became effectively the change in the law that many were struggling and fighting for. Yet another popular example of civil disobedience was its role during the anti-apartheid struggle in the early 1950s in South Africa. Protesters here simply broke existing laws by using public waiting rooms that were designated for white people at the time, which also resulted in a lot of protest, unrest even, and arrests. And many of those arrested, and amongst them also Nelson Mandela, were handed very long prison sentences, but many people took on those sentences to raise awareness. And as we know in the case of Nelson Mandela, who later became the first black president of the first democratically elected government of South Africa in 1994, spent many decades in prison, even though they were morally wrongfully condemned, prosecuted based on the way they saw it at the time. So these are only few examples in history where we can see that civil disobedience has brought upon fundamental and systemic change. And we therefore now turn to the role of civil disobedience in the 21st century.
So I would like to talk about civil disobedience in the 21st century in the next about 10 minutes. Civil disobedience has seen an uprise in various movements and across the globe in the past few years. I will point out a few examples in an attempt to outline the range of tactics used and contexts in which civil disobedience has played a role in recent times. Unfortunately, however, I won't be able to cover and represent the entire diversity of the movements and their tactics. Let me start with 3 examples from outside of Europe. In 2019, protests sparked in 2 different regions of the world that drew the attentions of the global public, especially to civil rights violations and threats to democracy. I'm talking about the protests in Hong Kong and Chile. In Hong Kong, protests were triggered by the introduction of a bill that would have allowed the extradition of wanted criminal suspects from Hong Kong to other territories like mainland China and Taiwan. After huge but unsuccessful demonstrations, some of the democracy activists then started to adapt civil disobedience and direct action techniques. Examples included disruption of government operations and occupying Hong Kong police headquarters. The protesters were successful with their first demand. The bill eventually got retracted. As the other demands, however, were not met, protests continued. After a relatively calm start into this year, the pro-democratic movement initiated new protests in mid-May, so just 2 weeks ago. After protest on Mother's Day was prohibited, during a following unlawful protest, more than 200 people got arrested based on the accusation of violating governmental measures to prevent and control the spread of the coronavirus. Chile is another example where acts of civil disobedience got triggered by new, unjust measures by the government and protesters then continued to speak up against unjust conditions in the countries more generally. In response to a price increase in the subway fare of Santiago's metro, the increased cost of living, privatization, and growing inequality in the country, protests started in autumn last year. The protest began in the capital, Santiago, as a coordinated fare evasion campaign by secondary school students, which led to spontaneous takeovers of the city's main train station and open confrontations with the national police force. President Piñera then declared a state of emergency, imposed curfews, and ordered the armed force to restore order. By the end of last year, as a result of the protests and the government's response, 29 people have died, nearly 2,500 were injured, and more than 2,800 arrested. In mid-November last year, just after declaring that the United Nations Climate Conference, so COP25, would not be held in Chile the following month due to the social unrest, the National Congress signed an agreement to call for a national referendum in April 2020 on the creation of a new constitution. The referendum then was rescheduled to October 2020 due to Corona. In North America, we have another case, this time from the land rights and environmental justice movement, where the final outcome is yet to be seen. In 2008, plans were submitted to build a Keystone XL oil pipeline. With tar sand oil being described as the world's dirtiest oil, the pipeline has faced years of sustained protests from environmental activists and organizations, indigenous communities, religious leaders, farmers, rangers, and business owners standing side by side. One such protest, a historic act of civil disobedience outside the White House in 2011, a so-called sit-in, which lasted for 2 weeks, resulted in the arrest of more than 1,200 demonstrators. After 7 years of continuous citizen protests, the Keystone protesters finally got their big win, or so it seemed. President Obama vetoed the pipeline. Sadly, however, the story doesn't end here. Immediately after taking office, President Trump reversed course on Obama's pledge. He signed an executive order to advance Keystone XL, as well as Dakota's Access Pipeline. Now, during the coronavirus pandemic, while the US is suffering the highest numbers of COVID-19 infection and fatality cases in the world, the oil industry has started construction work along the route of the Keystone XL pipeline. Moving over to Europe, I would like to mention an example from the housing rights movement first. In Spain, the PA, Platform for People Affected by Mortgages, responded to evictions due to a national housing crisis in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009. The PA is famous for its innovative protests, including physically stopping evictions, organizing sitting in banks and squats in empty buildings that belong to banks. Within 4 years, from 2009 until 2013, the movement prevented over 800 evictions across the country. These seemingly radical methods of political activism have gained widespread legitimacy. Most Spanish people now think that housing and mortgage legislation illegitimately favors the banks and that adequate housing should be a right. Ada Colau, who was one of the founding members of PA, is since 2015 the mayor of Barcelona. In Europe, especially climate justice movement as well has seen a recent rise in the use of civil disobedience. One of the most famous examples is Extinction Rebellion. Not even 2 years ago, Extinction Rebellion activists started by effectively closing 5 bridges in London and shutting BBC studios, demanding that the public service broadcaster tell the truth about the climate and ecological crisis. In spring last year, XR shut down portions of central London for 11 days. Despite receiving criticism from various other groups within the climate justice movement, XR succeeded in mobilizing huge numbers of people with 650 groups in 45 countries as of spring last year. as one of their three demands is declaring the climate emergency. Since then, over 1,400 local governments in 28 countries have made similar declarations following these debates that have been steered with the help of civil disobedience used by Extinction Rebellion. Ende Gelände is another name that, especially in the German context, has managed to get the public and media talking about climate justice. Maybe most known for its mass actions of civil disobedience, their actions are targeted against coal-fired power plants, and demands are an immediate fossil fuel phase-out. Although their broad alliance also engages in smaller blockades, occupations, etc., their signature actions are acts of civil disobedience involving several hundreds and up to thousands of people. After 4 years of mass mobilization, last year 6,000 participants occupied coal pits and train tracks for Germany's coal supply. The occupations result in power plants having to partially reduce their power generation operations for hours or sometimes even days. Although some voices raise doubts about the actual effects on reducing the burning of coal, Ende Gelände without doubt has managed to make civil disobedience more legitimate and concentrate the media's focus on the struggle for climate justice during their actions and beyond. With the COVID-19 pandemic worsening existing crises, activists around the globe now have to face a new reality. Plans for this year had to be cancelled as they and other actions and movement-building processes are being heavily affected. With inequality being on the rise during and after the pandemic, the constant effort to make actions of civil disobedience more inclusive receives a severe backlash. The access to participate in such actions will be even more restricted now for vulnerable communities and individuals due to, for instance, financial struggles. Overall, restrictive laws increase the legal risks of organizing protests while also oftentimes coming along with a moral question of organizing and participating in physical protests considering the now increased sanitary risks. Through the normalization of militarization, in which police forces and the army play a great role in supervising and controlling citizens, fears of more oppression by the state in the future are growing among many activists. Control, however, does not only take place in the physical space, but also is exacerbated through the implementation of laws that allow for geolocalization to control the spread of the virus and through so-called corona apps. The fear of congregations, which exists today during lockdowns, is expected to potentially last even after the lockdown, which may result in less participation of citizens in demonstrations, actions, and so on. In response, new forms of activism that are being deployed and experimented with are online tactics of civil disobedience, such as, for instance, shutting down or hacking websites, and also offline actions in the sphere of artivism, such as graffitis, or the public and decentralized display of banners, actions with smaller affinity groups, lock-ons, debt or rent strikes.